the grand estate known for its grandeur and the power it symbolized. The soft hum of the ocean waves was the only sound that filled the space as chandeliers glowed overhead, casting a warm, golden light across the polished marble floors. In the private lounge, away from the public eye, sat two of the most powerful men in the world, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Tonight wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary. It was supposed to be a quiet dinner. Donald Trump had invited Musk for a private meeting to discuss everything from AI to space exploration. The two titans of industry, always on the pulse of what's next, were known to have deeply unpredictable minds. And yet, there was one more presence in the room: Musk's young son, X. X was sitting between them, his small feet swinging slightly from the chair. His piercing blue eyes, so similar to his father's, were filled with an intensity that few would expect from a boy his age. Elon Musk had brought him along unexpected, but not entirely surprising. X had insisted, and Musk had shrugged. Might as well, he thought. Trump, ever the charmer, had laughed and agreed, the kid's got better taste than most politicians. The conversation began innocently enough: talk of politics, the upcoming election, and the economy. Musk, ever the visionary, spoke passionately about artificial intelligence and automation, warning of the risks of losing control over the direction humanity was heading. Trump, leaning in, with a glint of his deal-maker spirit, asked, "So, what's the move, Elon Musk? You planning to run for something, or just pull the strings from the sidelines?" Musk smirked, the tension in the room palpable. "I prefer to build things," he replied, ever the engineer. Trump chuckled, "That's what they said about me before 2016. The exchange was light, playful, but charged. These were two men who had reshaped the world in their own ways, yet had never quite confronted each other in such an intimate setting. But then, the unexpected happened. X, who had been quietly listening, tilted his head and looked directly at Trump. His voice was soft but unshaken as he asked a question that stopped the room dead. "Mr. Trump," he began, "are you afraid of being forgotten?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a brief moment, the room was still. Musk paused mid-sip, glancing at his son. Trump's face froze for a second, a quick flicker of something passing through his eyes. Was it surprise? Regret? Musk noticed, but Trump quickly recovered, bursting into that signature laugh, part performance, part amusement. "Forgotten?" Donald Trump chuckled. "Kid, I've got my name on buildings from here to Scotland. They'll be talking about me long after we're all gone." But X didn't blink. He didn't smile. "That's not what I mean," he said simply. Trump raised an eyebrow, intrigued but slightly confused. "Oh? What do you mean then?" X leaned forward slightly, speaking as though this question had been rehearsed in his mind 100 times. "I mean, when people talk about you 100 years from now, what will they actually say? Will they just remember your name, or will they remember who you really were?" For the first time in the conversation, Trump paused. His usual bravado faltered, and the words didn't come instantly. Elon Musk stayed silent, watching as Trump wrestled with the question, his eyes narrowed in thought. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a moment of introspection. Trump finally let out a slow breath. "Well, kid," he said, his voice now more measured, "the trick isn't making people remember your name. It's making them remember why you mattered." X tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "And why do you think you matter?" he asked. Trump's fingers stopped tapping the table, and for the first time all evening, The self-assured former president didn't have an immediate answer. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost reflective. "I woke people up," he said. "I made people realize that power isn't just for the elite. That they don't have to listen to some journalist or politician they can fight." X's expression didn't change, but his mind was working. He had been listening closely, absorbing every word. "So, you think you've changed the world?" he asked. Donald Trump leaned back slightly in his chair. "I did," he said firmly. "I made them listen." There was another pause. Musk, always the observer, watched his son's reaction. X, who had been asking these questions all night, wasn't finished yet. "But being remembered isn't the same as being understood," X said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. Trump went still. Musk's gaze flickered toward Trump, his mind working as he processed his son's words. X had struck a chord, a deeper, more profound chord than anyone expected. The silence in the room deepened. The conversation was no longer about politics or the future of technology, it had become about legacy, about what truly matters in the end. Trump looked at Musk, then back at X. There was a shift in the air, something neither of them had expected. X, with his calm, steady voice, had changed the direction of the evening. And as the ocean waves crashed outside, the sound of them seemed almost like an echo of the deeper question that had just been raised: would history remember the victories, or would it remember the true essence of who they were? As the evening progressed, the conversation shifted toward more pressing matters. The initial shock of X's question had subsided, but the underlying tension between Musk and Trump remained. Musk, always the innovator, was eager to dive deeper into their shared interests: technology, the future of humanity, and the role of artificial intelligence in shaping the world. Trump, however, had a different lens through which he viewed everything: power, influence, and the art of negotiation. Their differing perspectives clashed, but in a way that was strangely magnetic. Musk leaned forward, his eyes bright with passion as he spoke about artificial intelligence. "We're at the precipice," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "AI has the potential to either save or destroy humanity. The choices we make today will shape the future. If we don't act wisely, we risk losing control forever." Trump, who had been casually swirling the whiskey in his glass, set it down and locked eyes with Musk. "So, what's your move, Elon Musk?" he asked, his tone shifting to one of curiosity mixed with challenge. "You gonna run for something, or are you just gonna pull the strings from the sidelines?" Musk chuckled softly, the tension in the air palpable. "I prefer to build things, Donald," he replied with a smirk. Trump's lips twitched upward in a brief smile, but it didn't last long. "That's what they said about me before 2016, he shot back, leaning in, his voice taking on that familiar, almost conspiratorial tone. "We both know that's not enough. At some point, you've got to make a move. You've got to lead." Elon Musk didn't flinch, his expression still calm. "Leading doesn't always mean running for office," he said. "Sometimes, it's about innovation. About creating something that changes the world without the need for politics." Trump's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Elon Musk with a mix of admiration and skepticism. "You know, that's exactly what they said about me before the election. I was just a businessman, not a politician. But look at me now." The conversation was starting to feel like a game of chess, two minds circling each other, each calculating the other's next move. But just as Trump prepared to respond, X spoke again, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a knife. "Do you think," X began, his words deliberate and calm, "that it's enough to just change the world with technology? Or do you have to change the people first?" Trump blinked, caught off guard by the question. Musk, too, paused. Neither of them had expected X to ask such a profound question, one that reached beyond the scope of their current conversation. Trump looked at the boy, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he let out a low chuckle. "Kid, you've got a lot of questions," he said. "But I'll tell you this, it's not just about making people listen. It's about making them believe you matter. Making them understand what you've done for them." Musk's eyes flickered between X and Donald Trump. He could see that his son was onto something, something that neither he nor Trump had yet fully grasped. "But," Musk interjected softly, "being remembered is one thing, but being understood, that's a whole different challenge." Trump's gaze shifted from Musk to X. There was something in his eyes now, something that suggested he was starting to see the conversation in a new light. "Yeah, maybe," Donald Trump said, his voice quieter, more thoughtful than usual. "Maybe it's not just about power. Maybe it's about making people feel something real." X nodded slowly, processing the weight of Trump's words. "And if you can't make them feel it?" he asked, his voice unwavering. Trump leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table, a rhythmic sound that filled the silence. He was thinking, really thinking for the first time that evening. "Then," he said slowly, "maybe you've lost them before you even had a chance to win them over." The room fell into a heavy silence, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore outside the only noise. X, with his unyielding curiosity, had turned the conversation into something far deeper than any of them had expected. Musk watched his son, impressed by the way he had managed to turn a simple dinner into a profound reflection on life, legacy, and the true meaning of success. Trump finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a hint of respect. "I'll tell you one thing, kid," he said, glancing at X, "you're gonna be a force to reckon with someday. You've got a mind that doesn't just think, it challenges. And that's something most people are afraid to do." Musk smiled faintly, his pride in his son evident but unspoken. "He gets that from me," he said, his voice light but filled with a deep sense of truth. Donald Trump raised an eyebrow. "Does he, now?" Elon Musk nodded. "Partially. But he also gets it from himself." X, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke again. "So, what happens now? What do we do with all these questions?" The room seemed to pause, as if everyone was waiting for an answer, a resolution. But there was no simple response. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered but not unimportant. The conversation had shifted, leaving everyone with more to think about than before. The waves continued to crash outside, the rhythmic sound echoing the ongoing reflection that now filled the room. Musk and Trump, for all their differences, had found themselves in a rare moment of shared understanding. And X, with his calm yet profound insight, had shown them both that sometimes, the most important question is not about what you achieve, but how you make people feel. And with that, the evening continued, no longer just a meeting, but a turning point for all three of them. The silence stretched on, the conversation shifting like the ebbing tide outside. Trump, Musk, and X sat in an uneasy stillness. The grand room at Mar-a-Lago, usually bustling with energy, now felt like a sanctuary of deep reflection. X's question had landed like a stone in the water, creating ripples of thought that continued to circle through everyone's minds. Trump's usual bravado had faded, replaced by something more introspective. It was clear that his mind was not on his next political move or the empire he had built, but on something far more personal. X's words had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: in the end, it wasn't enough to be remembered for your name, your buildings, or your victories. What really mattered was how you impacted the people closest to you. And that was something Donald Trump had never truly stopped to think about. Elon Musk, too, felt the weight of the conversation. He had always been driven by the future, by space exploration, by technological advancements, by the next big breakthrough. But his son's question had stirred something in him. Musk had always prided himself on changing the world, but the truth was, he had been so consumed by his work that he had neglected the ones who mattered most. His own family. X, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. What if we're all so focused on changing the world that we forget the people who matter to us? Trump's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned toward the boy. There was no immediate response, but his mind was working, turning over the question in ways he hadn't before. He had spent so much time building, expanding his empire, and securing his legacy, but had he forgotten the real impact he could have on the people he loved? Musk felt a pang in his chest as he turned to his son. X's words were like a mirror, reflecting a truth that had been buried under years of ambition. He had built great things: Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, but at what cost? How many birthdays had he missed? How many moments had he let slip away, thinking that he was working for the greater good, when in reality, the greater good was sitting right in front of him? The sound of the ocean outside seemed to grow louder, as if the universe itself was urging them to confront this moment. Trump, for the first time that night, seemed at a loss for words. It wasn't that he didn't have answers, he always did, but for once, he didn't know how to respond. He looked at Musk, then back at X, and found himself questioning his own choices. "You've got a point," he finally said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "Maybe the world doesn't care about the name on the building. Maybe it's about the way people remember you after you're gone." Musk nodded slowly. He could see the change in Trump's demeanor. There was a vulnerability in his voice now, something Musk had rarely seen. Trump had always been a fighter, a man who prided himself on winning at all costs. But now, the words that hung between them weren't about winning or losing, they were about the lasting impact of their choices. X, still sitting calmly, spoke again, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "It's not enough to just be remembered. You need to be understood. Because if people remember you but don't understand why you did what you did, then maybe all your achievements mean nothing." The weight of X's words hung in the air, and the conversation took a turn toward the personal. No longer were they debating AI or space. Now, they were debating the very essence of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Trump shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "You're asking some tough questions for a kid," he said with a wry smile, though it lacked its usual edge. "But maybe that's the problem. We don't ask ourselves these questions enough. We get so caught up in the race, in the fight, that we forget to ask what we're really fighting for." Musk, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "I've asked myself those questions," he admitted. "But it's hard to come to terms with the fact that you can build an empire and still feel like you've missed out on the most important things in life." Trump glanced at Musk, his expression softening for a moment. "It's not too late," he said, almost as if he were reassuring himself as much as Musk. "You can still change things. We can still make a difference, maybe not in the way we thought we would, but in a way that actually matters. X nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. It's about what you leave behind. Not buildings or money, but the people you've touched. The people who will remember not just your name, but the way you made them feel. Elon Musk looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. It was rare to see someone so young grasp such profound truths. X had a way of cutting through the noise, getting to the heart of the matter. And as much as Musk had tried to shape his son into a thinker, he now realized that X had already surpassed him in many ways. Donald Trump, too, seemed moved. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ocean outside. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about his next move, his next deal. He was simply thinking about the legacy he would leave behind. Maybe you're right, he muttered, almost to himself. Maybe it's time to stop fighting the wrong battles. The room was quiet now, each man lost in his own thoughts. But there was a shift, a realization that had been sparked by X's simple yet profound question. The fight for legacy, for significance, wasn't about power or prestige. It was about the impact you had on the people around you, the ones who would remember you long after your name faded from history. Musk exhaled deeply, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't had in years. I've missed a lot, he said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. And I don't want to miss any more. Trump nodded, his usual sharpness returning. Well, then, he said with a small smile, we've got work to do. The waves crashed gently against the shore outside, as if echoing the promise of new beginnings. And in that moment, three men each with their own powerful legacy had begun to question what truly mattered in life. And maybe, just maybe, they would all leave behind something even more valuable than anything they had built. And so, the conversation continued, not as a business meeting or a political debate, but as a moment of self-reflection, a shift in perspective. The questions X had asked had changed everything. And the answers still unknown would shape the future in ways none of them could yet imagine. The conversation lingered in the air like an unresolved chord. After X's piercing question about legacy and impact, a subtle shift had taken place in the room. No longer was the focus on the technological advances of SpaceX or the political strategies of Trump's campaigns. Instead, the conversation had veered into uncharted territory, one of personal reflection and emotional depth. The evening had started with a sense of grandeur, a casual gathering of powerful minds discussing their futures. But now, the power dynamics felt less pronounced. There was a vulnerability that had settled over the group, especially with Donald Trump and Musk, two of the most public figures in the world, who had always projected certainty and control. But now, they found themselves facing questions they had never fully answered. Elon Musk broke the silence first, his voice quieter than before, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I've built rockets, he said softly. I've launched satellites, sent cars into space. But at the end of the day, does any of that really matter if I'm not here to share it with the people who matter most? His words hung heavily in the room. Donald Trump, who had been watching Musk closely, leaned forward, his gaze sharper than before. It was rare for him to hear such open vulnerability from anyone, especially Musk. For a moment, Trump said nothing. Instead, he mulled over Musk's words, the echo of his own experiences with his family surfacing. Finally, Donald Trump spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. I know what you mean, he admitted, almost reluctantly. I've spent so many years climbing the ladder, trying to build something that lasts, but when I look back, there's a lot of things I've missed. People I should have fought harder for. The air between them shifted. Musk, who had never expected to hear such words from the former president, nodded slowly. He could relate. But what Trump said next startled him even more. "Do you know what I regret most?" Trump asked, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "It's not the deals I didn't close or the elections I didn't win. It's the relationships I didn't fight for, the ones that could have been better if I hadn't been so focused on winning." Musk didn't know how to respond. He had never seen Trump so vulnerable before. The man who had spent decades in the public eye, unshaken by controversy and criticism, was now revealing a side of himself that few, if any, had ever seen. X, who had been listening intently, leaned forward slightly. "So, you think it's too late to fix those things?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with the wisdom of someone far older than his years. Trump paused, considering the question. He tapped his fingers against the table, a familiar gesture of thought, but this time there was no bravado in it. "It's never too late, kid," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "But sometimes, you realize a little too late what's really important." Musk watched the exchange between Trump and his son, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. There was something about the honesty between the two men that felt different. It wasn't about business or power, it was about something deeper. Elon Musk had spent his life looking ahead, always thinking about the next big challenge, the next technological leap. But what if that wasn't enough? What if the real work was right in front of him? Donald Trump looked at X, then back at Musk, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You've got a thinker here," he said, nodding at X. "I've got to admit, I didn't see that coming." X smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking a lot about what matters," he said simply. Musk felt a strange sense of pride mixed with guilt. Pride because X was shaping up to be far more insightful than he could have ever imagined. Guilt because he realized how much he had overlooked in his own life. His son had, in a matter of hours, made him rethink everything he had ever believed about success and legacy. "Sometimes," Musk said, almost to himself, "I think we get so caught up in building things that we forget what truly matters. But maybe it's not about building empires. Maybe it's about building relationships. About making the people who matter feel seen and heard." Trump, for the first time in a while, nodded in agreement. "That's the real challenge, isn't it?" he said. "It's easy to win the game. But it's a lot harder to win the people who matter." X, who had been quiet for a moment, looked up at both men. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Winning the game isn't enough if you've lost the people who really matter along the way." The room fell silent once more. The ocean outside continued its rhythmic crashing against the shore, the sound almost soothing, as if echoing the realization that had just occurred. There was no grand solution to the questions they were grappling with. There were no quick fixes, no easy answers. But in that silence, each of them was coming to terms with the idea that true success was not about building things that lasted, but about building connections that endured. Trump broke the silence first. "You know, this isn't how I thought the night would go," he said with a chuckle. "But I'll admit, you've both got me thinking." Elon Musk smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I've got any answers yet," he said. "But I think I'm ready to start asking the right questions." X, who had been silently observing the exchange, looked up at his father. "It's never too late, right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Musk's gaze softened as he looked at his son. "No," he said quietly. It's never too late. As the evening drew to a close, the conversation shifted again, this time toward lighter topics. But the shift in the dynamic between the three men was undeniable. Musk had always been driven by a singular focus: innovation, progress, and technology. But now, he found himself reflecting on the importance of the people who walked with him through life. Trump, too, was rethinking the way he had lived his life, his usual sharpness softened by the unexpected vulnerability that had emerged in the conversation. And X, for all his quiet wisdom, had helped bring about this change. In a few simple words, he had changed the course of the evening, turning it into something that would leave a lasting impact on everyone in the room. As the three of them sat there, the distant hum of the ocean filling the silence, it became clear that the evening had shifted them all, perhaps not in ways they could fully understand just yet, but in ways that would ripple through their lives in the days to come. The night had fallen silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy with unresolved tension or questions left unspoken. There was a quiet understanding now, a kind of peace that had settled in the room. The grandeur of Mar-a-Lago, once a symbol of wealth and power, now seemed almost irrelevant in comparison to the weight of the conversation that had unfolded. Trump, who had spent years managing the chaos of his public life, seemed smaller now, less imposing. Musk, usually so absorbed in his work, had been forced to confront the cost of his relentless ambition. And X, his young son, had become the quiet catalyst for their realizations, with his simple but profound questions that had cut through the noise. Musk was still processing the evening, his mind racing, yet slowing as he considered everything he had heard. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to step back from the world he had created: the rockets, the electric cars, the neural interfaces, and focus inward. He thought about the moments he had missed. The birthdays. The first steps. The quiet dinners he had skipped, always with the excuse of tomorrow. But now tomorrow felt like something fragile, uncertain. He turned to X, who sat quietly beside him, his expression serene but full of understanding. "You know, you've asked a lot of hard questions tonight," Elon Musk said, his voice more reflective than usual. "Questions that I think I've been avoiding for a long time." X met his father's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "It's not about the answers, Dad," he said softly. "It's about knowing that the questions are worth asking." Musk's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I'm starting to see that." He glanced at Donald Trump, who was leaning back in his chair, still thoughtful but with a look of quiet respect. "You're right, Donald," Musk continued. "It's not just about what we build. It's about the people we're building it for." Donald Trump nodded slowly, tapping his fingers on the table as he processed Musk's words. "You know, I've been asked for years about what it takes to be remembered," Trump said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of vulnerability. "People want to know how to leave a legacy, how to make an impact. And all I've ever said is, build something big. Make them look at you. But now, I'm starting to think that maybe, that's not enough." X spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "People will remember you for what you made them feel. Not just what you built. Because buildings crumble, businesses change hands. But feelings last. They shape who we are and what we do." Trump let out a long breath, as if something heavy had been lifted from his shoulders. "I think you're onto something, kid. I spent so much time trying to be larger than life that I forgot to be human. I forgot to connect with the people who really mattered." Elon Musk glanced at Trump, a new sense of understanding between them. The man who had built an empire through brashness and bold decisions was now speaking about the human side of life. Musk had never thought he'd see the day when Trump, of all people, would express such vulnerability. X's words had done something neither of them could have anticipated. The boy had become the bridge between two powerful minds, leading them into a territory they had never ventured before, the heart of what truly matters in life. The conversation shifted, but this time it felt different. There was no longer a need to prove anything or come up with clever retorts. It was no longer about who was right or wrong, it was about understanding, about facing the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath their success and ambition. X, ever observant, had been watching both men, sensing the transformation taking place. "I think," he said slowly, "the real question isn't whether you'll be remembered. It's whether the people who matter will understand who you really were. If they can't, maybe that's the part that really scares you." Musk turned his gaze to his son, his eyes filled with both admiration and a deep sense of gratitude. X had put words to something that Musk had never been able to articulate, something that had been gnawing at him for years. Trump exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand over his face as he processed the weight of X's words. "You know, you might be right about that. I think I've spent so much of my life focused on winning, on making sure my name would live on, that I never stopped to wonder if I was doing it for the right reasons." There was a pause. Trump leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his face more serious than it had been all night. "I didn't come here tonight expecting to have this kind of conversation," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad it happened." Musk nodded slowly, feeling a shift inside himself. "I think we all needed it," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time for me to start thinking less about what I can build and more about who I'm building it for." The conversation had come full circle, from ambitions of technological supremacy to the simple but profound truth that without the people you care about, everything else loses its meaning. Donald Trump and Musk, each with their own complex legacies, had begun to recognize that the real value of their achievements wouldn't be in the things they had built, but in the people they had changed along the way. As the night wore on, the trio fell into a comfortable silence. There was no longer any pressure to continue talking, no desire to fill the air with noise. Each man, in his own way, had come to terms with the deeper meaning of their lives and work. The soft sound of the ocean waves continued to fill the room, a gentle reminder of the passing of time. X, who had said so little, had managed to change everything. His simple questions had peeled back the layers of pride and ego, revealing the human core of both Musk and Donald Trump. And in doing so, he had shown them that sometimes the most important thing in life wasn't about reaching for the stars, but about understanding the people who were beside you on the journey. As the evening came to a close, Elon Musk stood up, his thoughts still swirling but his heart feeling lighter. "I think I've got a lot to think about," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Trump nodded, his eyes softer than they had been when the evening began. "We all do, kid," he said, looking at X with newfound respect. "But it's never too late to start." The three of them left the room together, not as figures of power or fame, but as men who had been forced to confront something far more significant, the kind of legacy they would leave behind, not in buildings or business deals, but in the lives they touched. And as they stepped into the night, the future no longer seemed so distant. It was here, in the quiet moments, with the people who mattered most. The following days were heavy with contemplation. After the profound exchange at Mar-a-Lago, both Musk and Trump found themselves grappling with thoughts and reflections they hadn't anticipated. The questions X had posed lingered in their minds, unanswered but not forgotten. Each man had returned to his usual routine, but the weight of the conversation had subtly altered the way they saw everything. Musk had always been a man of action, moving forward with precision, speed, and an unwavering focus on the future. But for the first time in years, he felt himself slowing down, questioning not just what he had built, but why he had built it. The relentless pursuit of success, of reaching Mars, of advancing artificial intelligence, of revolutionizing transportation had always been his mission. But now, with every quiet moment and every reflection, Musk was left wondering, at what cost? Trump, too, found himself in a similar state of self-reflection. Known for his unshakable confidence and larger-than-life persona, the conversation had forced him to look beyond the facade he had so carefully crafted. Despite his many victories, there was a gnawing feeling in him now, a question that had never been asked before: was he truly understood by those closest to him? The tension in the air was thick with unspoken words. Musk found himself thinking more about his children. How often had he been absent during crucial moments? How many times had he sacrificed family time for the sake of progress? The late nights working on projects, the constant pressure to innovate, to be the best, it had all come at a price, and Musk had been blind to it for far too long. The weight of his absence in his children's lives haunted him. As for Trump, the thought of his own children and the strained relationships he had at times with those closest to him weighed heavily. The success he had achieved, the wealth he had accumulated, and the name he had carved into history, what would it all mean if it wasn't shared with the people who had stood by him through it all? It was X's simple but profound question that had cracked open something they had both spent years protecting, an image of themselves that was untouchable, invincible. But now, as they sat in their respective spaces, the walls they had built began to crumble. One morning, Elon Musk sat down at his desk in his office at SpaceX, the hum of the building's activity around him barely registering. His computer screen blinked with a list of tasks, meetings, and projects, but none of it seemed as urgent as it once had. He felt an overwhelming pull to take a step back, to focus on the things that had always been waiting for his attention, patiently sitting on the sidelines of his ambition, his family, his children, the moments that had passed him by. He sat there for a long time, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His assistant's voice crackled through his phone. "Elon Musk, we need your decision on the Mars mission launch date," she said, her tone crisp and professional, oblivious to the turmoil brewing in Musk's mind. But Musk was no longer focused on the mission. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the missed birthdays, the milestones he had only seen in photos, the times he had told his kids he would be home soon but never made it. He exhaled deeply, his fingers finally tapping the keyboard to schedule a meeting, not about space, but about something much closer to home. He dialed his son, X's phone number, his heart beating slightly faster than usual. He had never been one to show much vulnerability, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But something about the conversation with Trump and X had changed him. He knew he had to make things right, to stop putting everything before what mattered most. It was time to listen, to understand, and to be there. Donald Trump, too, had spent the next few days reflecting, but his self-examination had been a little more chaotic, marked by moments of impatience, frustration, and confusion. The truth he had confronted about his relationships with his family was not an easy one to accept. He had spent decades building a public persona that demanded attention, but what about the people who had been there for him in private? He walked into his office one morning, the hum of activity outside his office door, the soft rustling of papers, and the distant sound of phones ringing. His eyes settled on a photo frame on his desk, one of his children, when they were younger, smiling up at the camera. That was before the many public battles, the media storms, the divisiveness. He reached for the photo, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. For the first time, the image didn't feel like a victory, it felt like a reminder of the relationships that had frayed over the years. Maybe it's not too late, he muttered to himself, recalling X's words. Maybe I can fix this. He picked up the phone, dialing one of his children. It wasn't an easy conversation, and he didn't expect it to be. But something had shifted in him, something he couldn't ignore any longer. The drive to rebuild his relationships, his legacy had overtaken everything else. Later that evening, Elon Musk and Trump found themselves sitting in a restaurant in New York, away from the cameras and away from the usual chaos. Musk had called Trump earlier in the day, suggesting they meet not to discuss politics or business, but to talk about something far more personal. They sat across from each other, the soft murmur of other patrons filling the background, the clink of glasses, the subtle sounds of life moving on around them. It was a rare moment of peace for both men. Musk was the first to speak. "I've decided," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm going to take a step back from some of my projects. I've been so focused on building the future that I've missed out on the present." Trump looked at him, his expression unreadable at first, but then it softened. "You know," Donald Trump said, leaning back in his chair, "it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't just building buildings. I was building a family. And I've spent too much time ignoring them." There was a long silence, the weight of their shared reflection filling the space between them. Finally, Trump spoke again, his voice quieter, but with a trace of something close to sincerity. "It's never too late, right? To make things right." Musk nodded slowly, his mind filled with a mix of emotions. "No. It's never too late," he said. "But we have to start somewhere. And I think it's time." For the first time that evening, both men were at peace with the decisions they were making. There was no fanfare, no dramatic conclusion. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes, the most important thing to do wasn't to conquer the world, it was to rebuild the connections that had been neglected. And so, as the evening wore on, Musk and Trump shared their final thoughts, their voices softer now, more reflective. The world they had once tried to change through forceful action and ambition was now something they hoped to influence differently. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be one worth taking, for it was a journey of understanding, healing, and rebuilding the very relationships that had always mattered most. And for the first time, both men felt ready to face what lay ahead, not as leaders of nations or empires, but as fathers, sons, and men willing to make things right, starting with those they loved most. The following days after their meeting in New York felt like a slow but meaningful unraveling of the past. Both Musk and Trump had made decisions that went against everything they had known, but deep down, they felt a sense of peace in their choices. It wasn't about walking away from their careers or their responsibilities, but about rediscovering the true meaning of success, one that was no longer just about accolades or accomplishments. Musk's office, once a place where he spent countless hours developing his ideas, now seemed distant to him. He found himself taking more walks, spending time with X, and re-evaluating the path he had taken. He knew the decision to step back wouldn't be easy. There was still so much to accomplish, so many frontiers to explore. But every day, the pull to be present in his children's lives grew stronger. He started small. He made more of an effort to attend school events, even if it meant rescheduling important meetings. He took time to sit and listen to X's thoughts, something he had long overlooked in his pursuit of building a better future. Each conversation with his son felt more like a gift than a duty. They talked about everything from science to philosophy, from dreams of space travel to the more grounded realities of relationships. X had a maturity beyond his years. He didn't just ask questions to provoke thought, he asked them because he genuinely cared about the answers. Musk was beginning to realize how much he had missed by focusing so narrowly on his goals. It wasn't just his son he had neglected, but his own humanity, the part of him that connected with others on a deeper level. Meanwhile, Trump found himself navigating a similar journey of introspection. His schedule had always been meticulously planned, his days filled with meetings, press conferences, and public appearances. But lately, he had found himself questioning the cost of all that. The relentless pursuit of power and influence had created a legacy built on ambition, but it had also eroded some of his most cherished relationships. He had spent so much time fighting for the future that he had forgotten to nurture the present. He took time to reach out to his children, each call a step toward rebuilding the emotional distance that had crept in over the years. The conversations weren't easy, there was still a lot of hurt, unspoken words, and unresolved conflicts, but with each one, a bridge began to form. He understood now that it wasn't about grand gestures or monumental decisions, it was about the small, consistent acts of love and respect that had the power to heal wounds over time. For Trump, the real turning point came when he sat down with his daughter. It wasn't a formal meeting or a discussion of business, it was simply a father and daughter talking about life, about family, about the future. The conversation didn't have any earth-shattering revelations, but it marked something profound in both of them. Donald Trump listened, really listened, for the first time in years. "I know I've been distant," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But I'm here now. And I want to be here not just physically, but emotionally." His daughter didn't say much at first, but when she did speak, it was with a tenderness that surprised him. "We've always known you were busy," she said softly. "But it's good to know you're trying." It wasn't an easy moment, but it was a start. A new beginning, built on the realization that true connections aren't made through power or prestige, they are made through vulnerability, understanding, and presence. As for Elon Musk, he had an epiphany one afternoon when he was sitting with X in a park, watching the world go by. The simple act of being present with his son, not distracted by work or the demands of the future, felt like a profound act of defiance against the very thing that had once consumed him, the need for constant achievement. "Do you think we can make it to Mars one day?" X asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Musk smiled softly, his usual quick wit not present for once. "I think we can," he said. "But maybe the most important thing right now is making sure we're present for the people who are right here with us." X nodded, taking in his father's words. "I think that's a good start." Musk couldn't help but laugh softly. His son, with his perceptive mind, had hit the nail on the head. They both knew that the dream of space travel would still be there, waiting for them, but the present, this moment with his son, was something that couldn't be taken for granted. For the first time, Musk allowed himself to enjoy the simplicity of life, the small moments that made up the bigger picture. And, as it turned out, those moments, those precious, fleeting moments, were the ones that brought the most joy. In the same way, Donald Trump found himself revisiting his past, understanding the importance of the bonds he had overlooked. As he spent more time with his family, he realized that, for all his achievements, it was these relationships that truly mattered. His legacy wasn't going to be built on towers or deals, it would be built on the foundation of trust and love he rebuilt with those he held most dear. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the Mar-a-Lago estate, Elon Musk and Donald Trump had another conversation. This time, it wasn't about politics or the future of humanity. It was about the present and what truly mattered. "I've spent so much time trying to get to the top," Trump admitted, his voice softer than usual. "But now I realize that the climb isn't nearly as important as the people you bring with you." Musk nodded, his thoughts reflecting the same sentiment. "I was so obsessed with building the future that I forgot to live in the present." Trump looked over at Musk, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Seems like we're both learning that the hard way." Musk smiled back, the warmth between them genuine, for the first time without any pretense or ambition clouding their exchange. "Maybe that's how we get to the real future," Musk said, his voice thoughtful. "By understanding the past and appreciating the people who are with us right now." Trump's eyes glimmered, a hint of something akin to peace crossing his features. "I think you're right." The conversation ended there, and for the first time, neither man felt the need to add anything more. It was the silence of understanding, of acceptance, of growth. And in that moment, both Musk and Trump knew that while their legacies were still unfolding, the foundation of those legacies had been irrevocably altered. The true measure of their lives, and the lives of those around them, would not be in the things they had built, but in the love they had shared and the relationships they had nurtured. As the evening drew to a close, the world outside seemed to continue at its usual pace, indifferent to the internal shifts taking place in the hearts of two powerful men. But inside, something had changed quietly, profoundly. And both Musk and Trump knew that they were now on a different path, one that led not to greater achievement, but to greater understanding. As the weeks passed, the changes within Musk and Trump became more evident. They were no longer the same men who had walked into that quiet dinner at Mar-a-Lago all those days ago. There had been subtle shifts in their perspectives, in the way they approached their work, and most profoundly in the way they interacted with their families. Musk's new approach to life, the deliberate slowing down of his once unyielding pace, began to ripple outward. He made more time for X, attending events he had previously dismissed as too small or insignificant. There was a noticeable warmth in his interactions with his son, a sense of presence that Musk had never truly embodied before. One afternoon, Musk and X found themselves walking through a park near their home. Elon Musk had come to appreciate these quiet moments more than he ever had before. The idea of simply being in the moment, observing life as it unfolded without rushing ahead to the next big thing, was something Musk had to teach himself. "Do you remember the time we went to see the sunset last year?" X asked as they strolled along the winding path. "You told me that the future was what we had to focus on." Musk smiled softly, the memory clearly still vivid in his mind. "I do," he said. "But I think I've come to realize that the present is just as important. It's the only time we actually live in." X nodded in understanding, his eyes thoughtful. "I think I like that," he said quietly. "The present is the part we can change." Musk looked down at his son, a wave of pride swelling in his chest. X had always been insightful, but now, in this moment, he seemed to understand something profound about life that Musk himself was just beginning to grasp. "You're right," Musk said, his voice carrying a new layer of warmth. "And maybe the future will take care of itself if we focus on the right now." Meanwhile, Trump, too, was navigating this newfound understanding of life. After the heart-to-heart with his daughter, he had started to reach out more. The distance he had once maintained with his children, perhaps even unknowingly, began to fade. He was still the same Trump, the sharp negotiator, the man who thrived in the spotlight. But now, there was a shift, an earnest desire to make amends where he could and rebuild bridges that had once seemed too far apart. Trump found himself on a long call one evening with one of his sons, the kind of call he hadn't made in years, just to talk, no agenda, no purpose other than reconnecting. The conversation was simple at first. They talked about the old days, about the things they used to do together, and about how life had changed. But then Trump found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in a long time. "You know," Trump said, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about the past, about when I wasn't around as much. I know I wasn't the easiest person to be around, always focused on my next move, but I want to change that." His son's response was measured but sincere. "I know, Dad," he said softly. "It's been tough, but I see you trying. That matters." Trump paused for a moment, absorbing the weight of his son's words. It wasn't an easy conversation. The past wasn't something that could be undone, but it was a start. It was a recognition that the only way forward was through honest communication and presence. As the call ended, Trump looked out of his office window, the weight of the city outside still palpable, but the heaviness inside had lightened. The realization that his relationships were just as vital as his career and public persona had taken root in him. There would still be battles, still be work to do. But for the first time, he understood that the legacy he left wasn't just about power or wealth, it was about the connections he made, the people he loved, and the impact he had on those closest to him. The ripple effect of these realizations continued, slowly but steadily, touching every aspect of their lives. Elon Musk, having found a new rhythm in his personal life, began to understand that balance didn't mean compromising his ambitions. Instead, it meant redirecting his focus, making space for the things that truly mattered: his family, his relationships, and the moments that couldn't be rushed. Work was still important, but it no longer dominated his entire world. For Trump, the journey was less about finding balance and more about unlearning old habits. The years of relentless ambition had taught him to view success through the lens of power and control. But now, he was beginning to view success differently, not as something you chase, but as something you cultivate in the relationships around you. One evening, they both found themselves on a call again, this time not about politics or business, but about their families. "I'm starting to understand what you meant the other day," Donald Trump said, his voice calm and more reflective than it had ever been. "The real victory is the one you don't see coming. It's the quiet moments that matter most." Musk nodded, hearing the sincerity in Trump's words. "I've been learning that too," he said softly. "Success isn't about the next big thing. It's about what we do with the time we have, the people we love, and the things we choose to make space for." There was a long pause, a moment of unspoken understanding between them. No words were needed, for both men had found clarity in the truth they had been seeking all along: the future would unfold in its own time, but the present, the moments spent with loved ones, the conversations that mattered, was what truly shaped the future. As the call ended, both men sat back in their chairs, a sense of fulfillment they had never before experienced slowly settling over them. Their legacies, they now understood, would not be defined by their wealth, their achievements, or their names etched on buildings. It would be defined by how they had chosen to be present for the people they loved, by the lessons they had learned, and the relationships they had rebuilt. It wasn't a dramatic conclusion, no earth-shattering event that marked the end of their journey. Instead, it was a quiet, profound shift, one that had been years in the making. But they both knew, deep down, that they had changed. And that was enough. The ripple effect of their decisions had started small, but it was beginning to reach farther than they could ever have imagined. The future they had once tried to control had been replaced with something more meaningful, a deeper connection to themselves and the people they held dear. And with that understanding, the possibilities felt endless. The ripples of change that had started with a simple dinner conversation continued to expand, touching not just Elon Musk and Donald Trump, but also the people closest to them. With each passing day, they both found themselves more present, more engaged, not just in their work, but in their relationships. For both men, the journey of rebuilding wasn't just about making amends, it was about rediscovering the importance of the people who had always been by their side. Musk, having reprioritized his life, started to understand the true essence of leadership. It wasn't just about leading companies or pushing the boundaries of human potential, it was about leading by example within his own family. The countless hours spent working on SpaceX or Tesla had been important, but now he recognized that the foundation of any great venture, any meaningful success, was rooted in the strength of the relationships you maintained. X had become not just his son, but his guide. Musk's realization that his family needed him, that the love and trust between them had to be cultivated daily, became a driving force in his life. One evening, after spending the afternoon working on a personal project with X, Elon Musk found himself reflecting on the things he had missed, moments so simple, yet so important. As the two of them sat together, side by side on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and purple, X spoke again, his voice casual but filled with that depth that Musk had come to admire so much. "You know," X began, looking up at his father, "there's something you've been telling me for a while now about pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But you've never told me why you're doing it. I mean, yeah, Mars is cool, and the tech is amazing, but why?" Musk paused, caught off guard by the question. It was one he hadn't fully asked himself before, despite his relentless pursuit of progress. X wasn't asking to challenge him, he was asking to understand. And that made all the difference. Musk thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I guess I always thought that reaching Mars, creating the next big tech revolution, that was the way to make the world better. To ensure humanity had a future. But is it the future you want?" X asked, his eyes searching his father's face, the question carrying an unexpected weight. Musk smiled, a sense of understanding beginning to take root within him. "No," he said quietly. "It's not just about Mars, or the tech. It's about giving people the chance to dream again. To realize that anything is possible if we work together. But you're right. The future I want is one where we don't lose sight of the things that matter most right here on Earth." X nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over him as he heard his father's response. "I think that's what I've been trying to say all along," he said softly. Musk smiled at his son, feeling a surge of gratitude. The clarity that X had brought to him, the way he had helped him focus not just on the grand visions, but on the personal, the tangible, the connections that truly mattered, was invaluable. Meanwhile, Trump, too, was experiencing the same type of clarity, though his journey had been different. The bridges he had been working to rebuild were not just with his family, but also with his public image. For so long, Donald Trump had defined himself by his public persona: strong, outspoken, and always in control. But with every passing conversation with his children, with every acknowledgement of the emotional distance he had created, he began to see a new path. He had started making a concerted effort to be present for his children, not just in the big moments, but in the quiet ones, too. One afternoon, he found himself sitting in a small cafe with his son, enjoying a cup of coffee. It was simple, far removed from the corporate boardrooms and rallies that usually filled his day. But in that moment, it felt like everything. "Remember when we used to do this when you were younger?" Donald Trump asked, his voice softer than usual. "Just sit and talk about everything and nothing at the same time." His son looked at him, the corners of his mouth turning up in a faint smile. "Yeah, I do. You were always so busy, but I always appreciated those times." Trump's heart tightened slightly. It wasn't that his son had never been appreciative, it was that he hadn't realized how important those moments were. In the past, he had seen time with his children as a luxury, something that could be sacrificed for the sake of his career. But now, the simple act of being present felt like a gift he had neglected for far too long. "I'm sorry I wasn't there more," Trump said, his voice steady but with an honesty that was rare for him. "I was so focused on building everything else that I missed the most important thing, the people who were here all along." His son nodded, a quiet acceptance in his eyes. "It's not too late, Dad," he said. "I see you trying now, and that's what matters." It was these small, genuine moments that began to heal the distance that had existed for so long. Trump wasn't trying to fix the past, he couldn't. But he was trying to make sure the future would be different. His legacy wasn't just going to be about his business empire, it was going to be about the relationships he rebuilt, the time he spent with his family, and the people who truly mattered. As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Trump and his children deepened. The phone calls, the simple conversations, the time spent together each moment added to the foundation of a new, stronger relationship. And for Trump, it was a reminder that no matter how much time had been lost, it was never too late to start over. Musk, too, began to see the importance of these small moments, these everyday interactions. The pursuit of the future didn't need to come at the cost of the present. In fact, it was the present that made the future meaningful. The memories he made with X, the lessons he learned from him, were becoming the cornerstone of a new kind of success, one that was measured not by accolades or recognition, but by the love and connection he nurtured within his family. The lessons that Elon Musk and Donald Trump had learned were not just about themselves. They were about the people they loved, the people who had always been there, waiting for them to see what truly mattered. As they continued on their journeys, each man with his own unique vision for the future, they knew that the road ahead would be different. It wouldn't be about rushing toward an end goal, but about appreciating each step along the way. And so, as they stood on the precipice of their legacies, the future ahead seemed less daunting, more hopeful. They had learned that the true measure of a life well lived wasn't about grand achievements or far-reaching ambitions. It was about the moments that defined the relationships they had, the people they touched, and the love they shared. The bridge between ambition and connection had been rebuilt, and both men knew that the journey they had embarked on was one worth taking slowly, thoughtfully, and with the ones who mattered most beside them. Nathan Kessler boarded the first-class cabin of the Dallas to Tampa flight with the confidence of a man who belonged there. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, the silver cufflinks glinting under the soft cabin lights. The scent of leather and expensive cologne hung in the air, mingling with the distant clink of champagne glasses. It was the sound of wealth, the sound of people who had already won at life. Nathan smiled to himself. This is my world. He slid into seat 3A by the window, adjusting his Rolex as he unlocked his phone. The flight was under 3 hours, not long enough to work, but plenty of time to enjoy the perks of first class. He signaled the flight attendant with a slight lift of his finger. Scotch. Need. The attendant nodded smoothly, disappearing down the aisle. Nathan's gaze drifted across the cabin, sizing up the other passengers. Businessmen scrolling through stock reports. Couples sipping champagne. Then his eyes caught on her. A blonde woman seated a few rows ahead, scrolling through her iPad. Her posture was poised, her demeanor calm, as if first class was nothing new to her. There was something familiar about her, but not enough to place. She's probably some reality star, Nathan muttered to the man seated beside him, a mild-looking traveler who already regretted his seating assignment. You know the type: big hair, designer bag, and no real substance. The man gave a polite, non-committal smile, keeping his eyes on the in-flight magazine. Nathan wasn't done. He glanced toward the woman again. She hadn't reacted. That didn't sit well with him. People like her, beautiful and privileged, were supposed to care what men like him thought. The flight attendant returned with his drink. Nathan took a slow sip, feeling the burn of the scotch in his throat. He watched the blonde woman as she handed her empty glass to the flight attendant with a quiet thank you and a small smile. Nathan's eyes narrowed. That kind of composed ease, it irritated him. He leaned toward his seatmate. She probably married rich, Nathan said, just loud enough for her to hear. That's usually how these stories go. This time, the blonde's hand stilled briefly on her iPad. No glance, no reaction, just a subtle stillness. Nathan smirked, thinking he'd finally gotten under her skin. But he had no idea just how wrong he was. Nathan took another slow scotch, letting the burn settle in his chest as he watched her. The blonde woman remained fixed on her iPad, seemingly unfazed by his remarks. That annoyed him. Most people, especially women, would have at least thrown in some acknowledgement that they'd heard him. But not her. His ego stirred. He wasn't used to being ignored. Seriously, Nathan said to his seatmate, pitching his voice just enough to carry a few rows. You ever notice how some people walk around like they're the main character in life? He gestured toward the woman with his glass. Like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie. The man beside him stiffened but didn't answer. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced up from his newspaper, brow slightly raised. The flight attendant slowed her pace as she passed. People were listening now. Nathan felt the familiar thrill of attention. He smiled. But the blonde woman didn't even blink. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her gaze fixed on the screen in front of her. Nathan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the armrest as he studied her. Maybe she was an actress. Or the wife of some hedge fund guy. Or maybe his personal favorite, a socialite clinging to the last shreds of her youth with the help of a plastic surgeon on speed dial. She looks familiar, he mused aloud. Some reality TV reject, probably. Or maybe the ex-wife of a senator. Nathan tilted his head, waiting for her reaction. Still nothing. That didn't sit right with him. The flight attendant returned with another round of drinks. Nathan smiled as the glass was placed in front of him. And whatever she's having too, he added with a smirk, nodding toward the blonde. The flight attendant's gaze didn't waver. She's fine, sir, she replied coolly, before walking away. Nathan's smile faltered. He wasn't used to this. He controlled conversations, he dictated the tone. But somehow, this woman was managing to pull him off balance without even saying a word. He glanced back at her, frustration curling at the edge of his thoughts. Who the hell was she? Why did she look so familiar? Then, for the briefest of moments, she turned her head slightly just enough for him to see the outline of her profile. Calm. Unbothered. Almost, amused. Nathan's jaw tightened. That look, it wasn't dismissive. It was knowing. And somehow, that was worse. The flight had settled into a quiet hum. Nathan's scotch sat untouched on the table as he continued to watch the blonde woman. He was obsessed now, his mind working overtime trying to figure her out. He hated that she'd gotten into his head without even trying. Finally, the seat belt sign flicked off, and the flight attendant reappeared. She approached the blonde woman with a quiet smile. "Ms. Bondi," the attendant said softly, "can I get you anything else?" Nathan froze. Bondi. The name rang in his head like a gunshot. Pam Bondi. The realization hit him hard. He suddenly recalled the televised court cases, the high-profile press conferences, the political commentary. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General. The woman who had gone head-to-head with Fortune 500 companies and walked away victorious. The woman who had shaped state policy and faced down some of the most powerful political figures in the country. And Nathan had just spent the last 20 minutes mocking her. His mouth went dry. He glanced toward her again, but now with completely different eyes. Pam Bondi wasn't just another pretty blonde in first class. She was a political bulldog. A woman who had the power to ruin men like him with a single phone call. Nathan swallowed hard. He sat back in his seat, fingers tightening around his glass. Pam didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The flight attendant walked away, and Nathan let out a shaky breath. His mind raced. He needed to fix this. To smooth things over somehow. He leaned slightly toward her. "I thought you looked familiar," he said, his voice strained with forced lightness. "Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty." Pam's gaze flicked toward him for a brief second. Then she smiled. Not warmly, just a slight, almost imperceptible lift of her lips. She said nothing. Nathan's stomach twisted. This was worse than if she had snapped at him. Worse than if she had called him out in front of the whole cabin. Because her silence told him exactly what he was worth. Nathan's confidence evaporated. His pulse hammered in his ears as he sat back, trying to regain his composure. He forced himself to take a breath. Get it together. But he couldn't. His mind was stuck replaying the last 20 minutes, the smirking comments, the mocking tone. How many people had overheard him? How many of them had recognized Pam Bondi before he did? The businessman across the aisle had a faint smirk on his lips. The flight attendant's expression was still perfectly polite, but there was an absence of warmth that hadn't been there before. Nathan took a long sip of his scotch, but it did nothing to steady his nerves. "I actually followed some of your cases," Nathan tried again, lowering his voice this time. "You've had quite the career." Pam didn't even turn her head. The rejection stung. Nathan hated feeling small. It was a foreign sensation, one he wasn't equipped to handle. "I guess it's not every day you end up sitting next to a former attorney general," he added. Pam's lips curled slightly, but still no words. Nathan's smile twisted. He glanced toward his seatmate. Guess I should have been more careful with my words, huh? His seatmate didn't look up from his book. Probably. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose. He was losing control of the situation, and worse, he knew everyone else could see it too. Pam set her iPad down, finally turning toward him. Her gaze was calm and direct. You were saying something about reality TV rejects. Pam's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Nathan's throat tightened. I didn't mean anything by it. Pam smiled faintly. Of course not. She picked up her iPad again and resumed scrolling. Nathan's chest tightened. The balance of power had shifted entirely. And for the first time in a very long time, Nathan Kessler was not the one holding it. Nathan's pride was bleeding. His first instinct was to fight back, to reclaim control. But how? He leaned toward Pam again. Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Pam didn't look up. Nathan smiled tightly. Can I buy you a drink? Pam set down her iPad. Slowly, deliberately, she turned toward him. You already offered. Nathan's smile faltered. And I already declined. Nathan's chest tightened. He knew what was happening now. She was letting him drown. You don't have to be so cold about it, he said. Pam raised an eyebrow. Am I being cold? Nathan's jaw tightened. Maybe a little. Pam smiled slightly. I think you're confusing confidence with indifference. Nathan exhaled shakily. He was out of his depth. And for the first time, he had no idea how to fix it. Pam leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs smoothly. Sit back, Nathan, she said, her voice low and steady. Enjoy the flight. Nathan swallowed hard. He sat back, heart pounding. This was not the game he was used to playing. And somehow, he already knew he was going to lose. Nathan sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of Pam's words still hanging in the air. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as they curled around his glass. He had never felt this off balance before. Not in a boardroom, not in a negotiation. He was Nathan Kessler, a man who controlled conversations, dictated outcomes. But here he was, sitting across from a woman who had dismantled him without even raising her voice. Pam Bondi had done nothing more than sit there, watching him unravel. And that's what made it so infuriating. He could handle confrontation, he thrived on it, but this quiet, effortless dominance left him unmoored. The flight attendant returned, pausing beside Nathan's seat. Another scotch, sir. Nathan opened his mouth to say yes but hesitated. He glanced at Pam, who hadn't even looked up from her iPad. Somehow, asking for another drink in front of her felt like admitting defeat. Just water, he said, his voice tight. The flight attendant nodded and moved away. Nathan could feel Pam's attention, even though her eyes were still on her screen. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the pounding of his pulse in his ears. Look, he said, leaning toward her again. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Pam's gaze remained fixed on the screen. I didn't mean anything by it, Nathan continued. It was just harmless conversation. Pam's eyes finally lifted to his. Calm. Measuring. Was it, she said. Nathan opened his mouth then closed it. Pam's expression softened, but not in a forgiving way. It was almost pitying. It's fascinating how quickly people dismiss the things they say as harmless. Nathan's throat tightened. I was just trying to make conversation. No, Pam said, her voice sharp and clear. You were testing me. Nathan's chest constricted. And now that you've lost, Pam added, you're trying to play it off as nothing. Nathan's jaw twitched. I'm not losing. Pam smiled faintly. Aren't you? The flight attendant returned with his water, setting it down with a quiet clink. Nathan didn't touch it. His hands were still curled into tight fists on the armrests. Pam picked up her iPad again. Relax, Nathan. It's just a flight. Nathan's gaze narrowed. It wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a game. And he was losing. Nathan's mind wouldn't settle. His pulse thudded heavily in his ears as he stared blankly at the seat in front of him. He couldn't stop thinking about Pam's words, the quiet authority in her tone, the way she'd stripped him bare without even trying. How the hell had it come to this? He'd spent his entire life crafting an image of control. He knew how to read a room, how to adjust his tone, how to manipulate conversations so that they always tilted in his favor. But this was different. Pam wasn't reacting the way most people did. She wasn't angry, she wasn't offended, she was simply dismissing him. Nathan rubbed his temple, feeling a headache creeping in. And then he realized why it bothered him so much. Pam Bondi wasn't the first person to make him feel this way. A memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome. Years ago, during his rise in the corporate world, there had been a woman named Rachel. A colleague. Intelligent, sharp, ambitious. Nathan had dismissed her, underestimated her, and in the end, Rachel had outmaneuvered him, landing the promotion he had been eyeing. It had been the first time Nathan had realized that charm and arrogance weren't enough to guarantee victory. He'd told himself it was a fluke, a rare misstep. But sitting here now, watching Pam Bondi effortlessly dismantle his ego, Nathan wondered if it had ever really been a misstep or if he had simply been blind to the fact that some people were playing a different game altogether. Pam's gaze lifted from her iPad briefly, meeting his. The look was brief, barely half a second, but Nathan felt it like a punch to the chest. He had been here before. And last time, he had lost. Nathan was still unraveling when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his business partner. Meeting confirmed. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Be sharp, this deal could change everything. Nathan's heart kicked up a notch. The Tampa meeting. A high-stakes merger that could push his company into the next tax bracket. Billions on the table. His mind sharpened until the second message came through. Oh, and I heard Pam Bondi might be involved. Better not screw this one up. Nathan's blood ran cold. Pam Bondi. Of course. She wasn't just an observer in this game. She was a player. Nathan's throat tightened. If Pam had influence over the deal and if she had already made up her mind about him, this could spiral out of control quickly. He took a shaky breath. This was no longer about pride. This was about survival. Nathan leaned toward Pam, lowering his voice. So. Tampa, he said casually. What takes you there? Pam didn't look up from her iPad. Business. Mine too, Nathan said, forcing a smile. Maybe we're attending the same meeting. Pam finally set her iPad down and turned toward him. Her gaze was cool, assessing. Maybe, she said. Nathan's smile faltered. Pam leaned back. Then I suggest you stop talking and start listening, Mr. Kessler. Nathan's heart hammered painfully against his ribs. This wasn't just about first-class mind games anymore. This was about his career. his future. And somehow, Pam Bondi was holding all the cards. The plane began its descent. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to fasten their seat belts. Nathan sat rigidly, his mind racing. He had to fix this. He had to find a way to win Pam over, if not for his pride, then for the sake of the deal. Nathan turned toward her. "Look. I was out of line earlier." Pam didn't react. "I underestimated you," Nathan said. "That was my mistake." Pam's gaze slid toward him. "Yes, it was." Nathan swallowed. "But I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong." Pam studied him for a moment. Then her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You're learning," she said softly. Nathan felt a flicker of relief. Pam turned back toward her iPad. "Now let's see if you can keep learning when it actually matters." Nathan's pulse quickened. "She's testing me." And for the first time, Nathan realized he wanted to pass. The plane touched down smoothly on the Tampa runway. Nathan stood as the seat belt sign flicked off. Pam rose beside him, gathering her things with practiced ease. Nathan hesitated. "Pamphlet." She turned toward him. "Maybe I'll see you in that meeting tomorrow," Nathan said. Pam smiled faintly. "Maybe." Nathan's hand tightened around the handle of his carry-on. "And if I do, maybe you'll be impressed." Pam's smile widened slightly. "We'll see." Nathan watched her walk down the aisle toward the exit. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan didn't feel resentment. He felt respect. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of hope. Nathan exhaled, squared his shoulders, and followed her into the terminal. He had lost the game on the plane. But tomorrow? Tomorrow was a new day. Nathan adjusted his tie as he entered the glass-walled conference room overlooking the Tampa skyline. His reflection stared back at him in the polished surface of the glass-sharp suit, confident posture, but his pulse hammered beneath the surface. He scanned the room quickly. A long mahogany table stretched down the center, lined with leather chairs. At the head of the table sat 3 board members, serious men in tailored suits. To Nathan's left was his business partner, Paul Marston, who offered him a tight nod. Across the table sat representatives from the rival firm, including Charles Eddings, a name Nathan had learned to hate over the years. But it wasn't Charles Eddings that made Nathan's stomach twist. It was Pam. She sat 3 seats down from Charles, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek knot, and a slim tablet sat in front of her. Calm. Controlled. Unbothered. Nathan felt his confidence slip. She's involved. Of course she's involved. Charles's smirk widened as Nathan sat down. "Kessler," he said smoothly. "I hear you had an interesting flight." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Let's stick to business." Pam's gaze flicked toward him, but her face remained neutral. The room settled into tense silence as the meeting began. Paul leaned toward Nathan and whispered, "We need this deal." Nathan took a breath. He had prepared for this. He had numbers, projections, and leverage. He just needed to stay focused. Pam's gaze sharpened. Nathan had the distinct feeling that the real negotiation wasn't with the board, it was with her. "Mr. Kessler," one of the board members said, "we've reviewed your proposal. The numbers are strong, but we have some concerns about the long-term scalability of your model." Nathan smiled faintly. "I anticipated that," he said smoothly, sliding a file across the table. Page 3 addresses that directly. The board member schemed the page, nodding slowly. Impressive. Nathan felt his confidence rebuilding until Charles spoke. Impressive, Charles echoed, but it's not enough. Nathan's gaze sharpened. Explain. Charles smiled. Your proposal assumes a linear growth rate. That's optimistic, considering market volatility. If we're going to commit to a long-term contract, we need assurance that your projections are realistic. Nathan opened his mouth, but Pam spoke first. I'd like to hear Mr. Kessler's response, Pam said, her voice smooth and even. Nathan's mouth went dry. Charles smiled faintly. Of course you would. Nathan exhaled sharply. This wasn't just business anymore, this was personal. And Pam Bondi had just handed him the stage. He forced his voice to steady. We've accounted for volatility by maintaining diversified assets across multiple sectors. The growth projection isn't based on assumptions, it's supported by market performance over the last 3 years. Pam's gaze didn't waver. And if the market shifts? Nathan smiled tightly. Then we adjust. Pam's lips curled slightly. Good answer. Charles's smile tightened. He wasn't pleased. Nathan's pulse steadied. He wasn't out yet. The meeting stretched on for another hour. Nathan handled the questions with practiced ease, staying focused despite the tension in the room. Pam didn't speak often, but when she did, her questions cut directly to the heart of the proposal. And then, near the end of the meeting, she asked the question Nathan had been dreading. You're proposing a 5-year contract, Pam said. How do you intend to maintain consistent performance over that period? Nathan's stomach tightened. He had expected this question, but not from her. Charles leaned forward. Yes, Kessler. How do you intend to guarantee that? Nathan hesitated for half a second too long. Pam's gaze sharpened. Nathan's mind scrambled for a response. He had data to support the projection, but Pam wasn't asking about the numbers. She was asking about him. I have a strategy for that, Nathan said, his voice smooth. Diversification across multiple sectors reduces risk. Pam's gaze didn't shift. And if that fails? She asked. Nathan's heart hammered. I adapt, Nathan said carefully. Pam's gaze held his for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. I hope so. Nathan released a shaky breath as the meeting wrapped up. Charles stood, offering his hand to one of the board members. Nathan rose to shake hands with Paul. Pam stood last. She walked toward the door but paused beside Nathan. Nice recovery, she said. Nathan smiled faintly. Was that a test? Pam's eyes glinted. Of course it was. And? Pam leaned in slightly. You passed, barely. Nathan's breath hitched. See you at the next meeting, Mr. Kessler. Pam turned and walked away, heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Nathan watched her go. He wasn't sure if he had won. But he knew one thing, Pam Bondi wasn't done with him yet. Nathan loosened his tie as he stepped out onto the street. The Florida heat pressed against his skin. Paul stepped up beside him. That was close. Nathan smiled faintly. I had it under control. Paul gave him a look. Sure you did. Nathan's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Impressive. Pamphlet. Nathan smiled. He had no idea how Pam Bondi had gotten his number. But somehow, he wasn't surprised. Nathan had barely stepped into his office the next morning when his assistant appeared at the door. "Sir, there's a visitor here to see you." Nathan frowned. "Who?" Pam Bondi stepped into the room. Nathan straightened. "Ms. Bondi." Pam smiled faintly. "Mr. Kessler." Nathan gestured toward a chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Pam sat gracefully, crossing one leg over the other. "There's another deal on the table. One that requires creative handling." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "And you're offering it to me?" Pam's smile widened. "I'm offering you the chance to prove that yesterday wasn't a fluke." Nathan's heart raced. Pam leaned forward slightly. "Are you interested?" Nathan's smile sharpened. "You already know the answer to that." Pam's gaze darkened. "Good. Because this time, I won't make it easy." Nathan's smile widened. "I'd be disappointed if you did." Chapter 15, The Game Continues. Nathan watched Pam walk out of his office, her figure disappearing down the hallway. He sat back in his chair, a slow smile curling on his lips. Pam Bondi was not just another opponent. She was a master of the game. And Nathan had every intention of learning how to beat her. Or maybe, just maybe, learning how to keep up with her. Nathan leaned back in his chair after Pam left the office, but his mind was already calculating. Pam had given him a challenge, one that could either elevate him to the next level of power or sink him completely. His phone buzzed. A message from Paul. "Just got word Bondi's." This could get messy. Nathan's jaw tightened. Of course Charles Eddings was involved. He stood, buttoning his jacket. If Pam was pulling him into this, then it was more than just business. This was a game of influence and strategy. And Pam had just dealt the first card. Nathan's driver was waiting downstairs. He slid into the back seat, his phone already pressed to his ear. "Paul," he said as the car pulled away from the curb. "Get me everything on Bondi's deal. Background, players, any leverage we can find. I want to know who stands to gain and who stands to lose. And Eddings." Paul's voice crackled over the line. Nathan's gaze darkened. "Leave him to me." Nathan ended the call and stared out the window as the city blurred past. Pam Bondi didn't make casual moves. If she'd come to him with this deal, it meant one of two things. She either trusted him, or she was testing him. And Nathan Kessler didn't fail tests. Nathan entered the private meeting room in one of Tampa's most exclusive clubs. The lighting was low, the air heavy with cigar smoke and quiet conversation. Pam was already seated at the corner table. "You're late," she said without looking up. Nathan slid into the seat across from her. "You didn't give me much notice." Pam's lips curled. "You're resourceful." A waiter approached. Pam ordered a glass of white wine. Nathan requested a scotch. Pam set her tablet down on the table, turning it toward Nathan. A contract appeared on the screen, dense with legal language and financial terms. "This is the deal," Pam said. "A merger between two energy firms. Potential to reshape the market for the next decade." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the terms. "And why are you involved?" Pam's gaze sharpened. "Because I helped broker the initial negotiations. And because Charles Eddings wants to control the outcome." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Eddings again?" Pam leaned back in her chair. "He's planning to undercut one of the firm's strip assets, consolidate power. If he succeeds, the fallout will affect the market for years." Nathan smiled faintly. And you want me to stop him? Pam's expression was cool. I want you to outplay him. Nathan's pulse quickened. Why me? Pam's gaze sharpened. Because you know how Eddings plays the game. And because I think you've finally learned when to stop talking and start listening. Nathan's smile darkened. You think so? Pam's eyes glinted. Prove me right. The waiter arrived with their drinks. Nathan took a slow sip of his scotch. And what happens if I win? Nathan asked. Pam smiled faintly. Then you'll have earned my trust. And if I lose? Pam's eyes darkened. Then you'll find out what it feels like to disappoint me. Nathan's breath hitched. Pam stood gracefully, gathering her things. I'll expect an answer by tomorrow morning, Pam said, her voice light but sharp. Nathan watched her walk away, his mind already working. Pam Bondi had just set the board. Now it was his turn to make a move. Nathan's mind was a machine as he walked into his office the next morning. He had stayed up all night analyzing the terms of the deal. Eddings was playing dirty hidden clauses, back-channel negotiations, and off-the-books incentives. Nathan smiled coldly. Amateur. Paul was already waiting for him. I've got the full breakdown, Paul said. Eddings is using a shell company to buy up shares under the radar. If he controls 51% by the end of the week, he'll own the board, Nathan finished. Paul hesitated. How are you planning to stop him? Nathan's smile sharpened. By making him think he's already won. Paul frowned. That's risky. Nathan picked up the phone. So is standing still. He dialed a number. A moment later, Pam's voice answered. Good morning, Mr. Kessler. Nathan's smile deepened. Let's talk strategy. Nathan and Pam met that evening in a private suite overlooking the bay. Pam wore a crisp black dress, her expression calm. Nathan slid a file across the table. This is how we play him, Nathan said. Pam's gaze sharpened as she opened the file. Eddings thinks he's secured enough shares to control the vote, Nathan continued. But I've arranged for a third-party investor to come in last minute and disrupt the balance. Pam's brow lifted. And how exactly did you secure this investor? Nathan's smile darkened. Let's just say I made a phone call. Pam's lips curled slightly. Interesting. Nathan leaned closer. By the time Eddings realizes what's happened, it'll be too late. Pam studied him for a moment. You sound confident. I'm not confident, Nathan said. I'm sure. Pam smiled faintly. Then let's see if you're right. The boardroom was packed the next morning. Eddings sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but his eyes predatory. Nathan took a seat across from him. Pam sat 2 chairs away, perfectly composed. The vote began. As expected, Eddings controlled a narrow majority. His smile widened. And then the third-party investor entered the room. Eddings's face darkened. He whispered something to his lawyer. His eyes flicked toward Nathan. Nathan smiled. Shall we continue? Nathan said smoothly. Eddings's jaw tightened. He had lost. Pam's gaze flicked toward Nathan, a spark of amusement in her eyes. The board vote shifted. The deal was secured. Nathan stood as the meeting ended. Eddings shot him a murderous look as he left the room. Pam walked over to Nathan, her eyes glinting. Well played, Mr. Kessler. Nathan's smile sharpened. Told you I could handle it. Pam's gaze lingered on him. Perhaps you're finally learning. Nathan's hand brushed against hers briefly. And if I am? Pam's smile deepened. Then maybe, this is just the beginning. Nathan's pulse quickened as Pam turned and walked toward the... She's not done with me. And this time Nathan didn't want her to be. Nathan stood at the Wynn's office later that evening, whiskey glass in hand. The city lights flickered below. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Pam. Drinks tomorrow night? Let's see if you're as good as you think you are. Nathan's smile widened. He picked up his phone and typed. Only if you promise to play fair. Pam's reply was immediate. Where's the fun in that? Nathan's chest tightened. His gaze darkened. Pam Bondi wasn't just an opponent. She was a partner. And the game had only just begun. Nathan adjusted his cufflinks as he entered the rooftop bar overlooking the city. The evening air was cool, but the tension in his chest was burning hot. Pam was already seated at the edge of the terrace, her silhouette outlined against the city lights. A glass of white wine sat in front of her. Nathan slid into the seat across from her, signaling the waiter for a scotch. You're late, Pam said without looking up. I wanted to make an entrance. Pam's lips curled slightly. Careful, Mr. Kessler. Confidence and arrogance often travel hand in hand. Nathan smiled faintly. So which one am I tonight? Pam's gaze lifted to his. I'm still deciding. The waiter returned with Nathan's drink. He took a slow sip, watching her over the rim of his glass. So what's next? Nathan asked. Pam set her glass down. We have unfinished business with Eddings. Nathan's smile sharpened. I thought I already buried him. Pam's gaze darkened. You wounded him. He's not dead yet. Nathan's pulse quickened. He leaned forward slightly. And what do you propose we do about that? Pam's eyes glinted. We finish the job. Nathan's smile widened. Nathan sat across from Eddings in a private boardroom. Eddings's face was a mask of calm, but Nathan could see the cracks beneath the surface. You think this is over? Eddings said coolly. Nathan smiled faintly. Oh, it's already over. Pam stood at Nathan's side, her arms crossed. You underestimated him, Charles. Eddings's gaze darkened. You think you've won? Pam's smile was razor sharp. No. We know we've won. Nathan slid a file across the table. Your assets have been frozen. The third-party investor? Our contact. Eddings's jaw tightened. You have two options, Nathan said. Sell to us at market value, or lose everything when your stock collapses tomorrow morning. Eddings's eyes flashed with cold fury. You set me up. Pam's smile sharpened. You set yourself up. Nathan leaned forward. Tick-tock, Charles. Eddings's hands curled into fists. His lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear. After a long, painful pause, Eddings signed the document. Nathan slid the file back toward him with a satisfied smile. Pleasure doing business with you, Nathan said. Eddings's gaze burned with hatred as he stood and stormed out of the room. Nathan exhaled slowly. And that is checkmate. Pam's smile widened. I'm impressed, Nathan. Nathan's gaze lingered on her. Good. I was hoping you would be. They left the building together, walking side by side through the cool night air. Pam's heels clicked softly against the pavement. You handled yourself well today, Pam said. Nathan smiled faintly. Only because you gave me the opening. Pam's gaze sharpened. Don't underestimate yourself, Nathan. You saw the opportunity and took it? That's rare. Nathan stopped walking. Pam turned toward him, her expression calm but expectant. Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then he stepped toward her. Pam's eyes darkened. Nathan's hand brushed her arm. So, what happens now? Pam's lips curled. That depends. On what? Pam's hand slid against his tie, adjusting it slightly. On whether you're smart enough to know that this is only the beginning. Nathan's heart hammered. His hand slid around her waist, pulling her toward him. Pam didn't resist. Nathan's gaze flicked to her lips, then to her eyes. Pam smiled faintly. Well. Nathan leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. And then he kissed her. Pam's hand curled against his chest as she kissed him back. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous. Nathan pulled back after a moment, his forehead resting against hers. Pam's lips curled. Not bad. Nathan smiled. I'm just getting started. Nathan sat in his office 2 days later, reviewing the finalized contracts. The deal was locked down. Eddings was out. The company was his. Pam entered the office without knocking. Nathan smiled as she closed the door behind her. You look pleased with yourself, Pam said. Nathan leaned back in his chair. I should be. Pam approached his desk and dropped a file in front of him. Nathan's gaze narrowed. What's this? Pam's expression darkened. Eddings isn't finished. Nathan sat up. Explain. Pam's gaze sharpened. He's backing another firm. Quietly. If they acquire enough shares, they could undermine your position. Nathan's jaw tightened. And when does this happen? Within 48 hours. Nathan's smile sharpened. Then we have 48 hours to stop him. Pam's eyes glinted. What's the plan? Nathan stood and adjusted his jacket. Follow my lead. Pam's smile widened. Careful, Nathan. You might be starting to enjoy this. Nathan's gaze darkened. Who says I'm not? The conference room was quiet. Nathan sat across from Eddings's newest ally, a young, sharp executive with cold eyes. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. You've made a mistake. The executive smiled faintly. Have I? Nathan slid a file across the table. You should read that. The executive opened the file. His smile faded. You've just signed a contract with a shell company owned by my firm, Nathan said. The executive's expression darkened. That's impossible. Nathan's smile sharpened. No. It's strategy. Pam's gaze flashed with amusement from across the table. Nathan stood as the executive signed the paperwork. Eddings had lost. For good this time. Pam stood beside Nathan as the board members left the room. Nathan turned toward her. Satisfied? Pam's eyes gleamed. Almost. Nathan's hand brushed against hers. What's left? Pam's gaze darkened. Oh, I'm sure we'll find something. Nathan smiled. I'm counting on it. Pam's lips curled. Nathan's pulse quickened. He had started this game thinking he could control it. But now he wasn't sure who was leading anymore. And for the first time he didn't care. Nathan stood on the rooftop terrace that evening, a glass of scotch in hand. Pam leaned against the railing beside him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. You've come a long way, Nathan, Pam said softly. Nathan's gaze slid toward her. Because of you. Pam smiled faintly. No. You were always capable of this. Nathan's hand brushed against hers. So what happens now? Pam's eyes darkened. Now, we see how far we can go. Nathan smiled. Together. Pam's lips curled. If you can keep up. Nathan laughed softly. Try me. Pam's gaze softened. Nathan leaned toward her. And as the city lights sparkled beneath them, Pam kissed him again, slow and dangerous. This time, Nathan knew exactly what he was getting into. And for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of losing. Because this time, he wasn't playing alone. Ethan Carter sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the hum of the radio filling the quiet night. Willow Creek was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. After 20 years on the force, Ethan had learned that most trouble in Willow Creek was minor a bar fight, a stolen bicycle, or the occasional teenager sneaking beer into the park. But the call he received that night was different. All units, report to 1456 Willow Street. Possible abandonment case. Multiple minors involved. Ethan's jaw tightened as he flipped on the siren and sped toward the address. Willow Street wasn't exactly the best part of town. It was lined with worn-down houses and peeling paint, the kind of place where people struggled to make ends meet. As Ethan pulled up to the house, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The porch light flickered. The windows were dark. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. From inside the house, he could hear it faint crying. High-pitched and desperate. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he approached the door. Police. Is anyone inside? No answer, just the sound of sobbing. Ethan pushed the door open, and his breath caught in his throat. 6 children. Huddled together in the corner of the dimly lit room were 6 little girls, the oldest looking about 12, the youngest no older than 4. They clung to each other, their wide eyes brimming with fear. The room was practically empty, a worn-out couch pushed against the wall, a broken coffee table littered with empty cans and torn papers. The oldest girl, dark braids falling across her shoulders, stood protectively in front of the others. Her chin lifted in quiet defiance despite the fear in her eyes. "It's okay," Ethan said, lowering his voice as he crouched down. "I'm here to help." The girl didn't move. Her gaze was sharp, guarded. "Who are you?" Ethan asked softly. "Amaya," she said, her voice steady. "And these are my sisters. Lena, Sierra, Tiana, Ava, and Jasmine." "Where are your parents?" Amaya's face darkened. "They're not coming back." Ethan's heart twisted painfully. "Do you have any other family we can call?" Amaya shook her head. "Then where have you been staying?" "Here," Amaya whispered. "We were waiting for them to come back." Ethan took a deep breath. He knew how the system worked. If there was no next of kin, these girls would be separated, scattered into different foster homes. And 6 girls. They'd never be kept together. "We can't stay here," Ethan said. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Amaya's eyes narrowed. "Together. Together." Amaya studied him for a long moment before giving him a reluctant nod. Slowly, the other girls began to emerge from behind her, their small hands clutching each other's shirts. "Come on," Ethan said softly, holding out his hand. "Let's get you home." As he led them outside to the car, Jasmine, the youngest, slipped her hand into his. Ethan's heart swelled painfully as he helped them into the back seat. As he drove them toward the station, Amaya's voice cut through the quiet. "Are you going to send us away?" "No," Ethan said. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'll figure something out." And as he glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing 6 sets of frightened eyes watching him, something shifted in his chest. He didn't know why, but he was already certain. He wasn't letting them go. Ethan's house had been quiet for years. After his wife passed away, the silence became a strange comfort, a familiar loneliness. But now it was chaos. Lena and Sierra were arguing over a spot on the couch. Ava was sitting on the floor playing with a stuffed animal, while Jasmine followed Ethan around the house like a shadow. Amaya stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes distant. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, standing in the center of the room. He'd been a cop for 20 years, faced down armed criminals and saved lives, but this was uncharted territory. "All right," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "Let's get some dinner." He opened the fridge and immediately realized two things. "Well, what do you want?" "Rice and chicken," Amaya said. Ethan frowned. "I don't know how to make that. Mom used to make it with onions and peppers." Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. "All right. Let's give it a shot." An hour later, the kitchen was a disaster. There was rice stuck to the stove, and Ethan was pretty sure he'd overcooked the chicken. He sat the plates down in front of the girls, prepared for them to hate it. Amaya took a bite. Her gaze met his across the table. "It's not terrible." Ethan smiled. Sierra grinned. "It's actually kind of good." Ava and Lena nodded in agreement. "You know," Ethan said, leaning back, "I might get the hang of this." That night, as Ethan was turning off the lights, Amaya's voice stopped him. "Ethan." "Yeah. Thanks." Ethan's heart squeezed. "For what?" "For trying." He smiled into the dark. "Anytime, kid." And for the first time since his wife passed, Ethan Carter fell asleep, not to the sound of silence but to the soft, steady breathing of his new family. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill in the air. Ethan stood in the driveway, watching the girls pile into the car. Amaya sat in the front seat, her arms crossed over her chest, while Sierra, Tiana, Lena, Ava, and Jasmine squeezed into the back. The chatter and occasional bickering among them filled the car with a chaotic warmth that Ethan was slowly getting used to. "All right, first day," Ethan said as he adjusted the rearview mirror. "Everybody ready?" No one answered. Ethan sighed. "Okay, then. Let's go." The drive to Willow Creek Elementary was quiet. Amaya stared out the window, her face set in stone. Tiana sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, jaw clenched. Sierra was nervously fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. As Ethan pulled up to the school, the reality of the situation hit him hard. Willow Creek was a predominantly white town. There were very few black families, and none of them were as large or as visible as Ethan's new household. Amaya's gaze darkened as the other students started staring the moment they stepped out of the car. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others openly gawked. Ethan crouched down next to Amaya, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Hey. It's going to be okay." Amaya's expression didn't soften. "You don't know that." "You're right," Ethan said. "But you've got each other. And you've got me." Amaya's eyes softened, but the hardness didn't disappear completely. She gave him a small nod before leading the others toward the front door. Ethan watched them go, his heart heavy. But things unraveled faster than he expected. Later that afternoon. "You need to come down to the school immediately." Ethan's heart dropped at the sound of the principal's sharp tone over the phone. He grabbed his jacket and drove straight to the school. When he walked into the principal's office, he found Tiana sitting in a chair, her arms crossed and her expression set in defiance. Across from her was Coach Miller, his face twisted in anger. "Mr. Carter," the principal began. "We have a situation." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "Tiana was involved in a fight during gym class." Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She sat stiffly in her chair, her eyes dark and cold. "Is that true?" Ethan asked. Tiana's jaw tightened. "I didn't start it." She was disrespecting the other students, Coach Miller interrupted. Aggressive. And when one of the boys called her a name, she hit him. What name? Ethan's voice sharpened. Coach Miller hesitated. It's not important. It's important to me. Tiana's face darkened. Her lips pressed into a hard line. He called me the N-word. The room went cold. Ethan's eyes flashed toward Coach Miller, whose expression immediately turned defensive. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence, the principal said carefully. We're suspending her for 3 days. Ethan's voice was low and dangerous. You're suspending her for defending herself against a racial slur. Rules are rules, Coach Miller said dismissively. But I guess it's okay for one of your students to call her that. We're addressing that separately. Separately? Ethan scoffed. So Tiana gets suspended while the kid who insulted her gets a slap on the wrist. It's complicated, the principal said, clearly uncomfortable. No, Ethan growled. It's not. Ethan crouched down beside Tiana, meeting her eyes. What happened? He said I didn't belong here, Tiana whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. That I should go back to where I came from. And I told him to shut up, but he wouldn't stop. So I hit him. Ethan swallowed the wave of rage rising inside him. He took a deep breath and gently took Tiana's hand. You're not in trouble with me, Ethan said softly. And you do belong here. Tiana's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Mr. Carter, you need to control your daughter's behavior, Coach Miller said. Ethan stood slowly, his expression dangerously calm. Let me be clear, Ethan said, his voice low. Tiana isn't the one who needs to learn how to behave. If you think I'm going to let you punish her for standing up for herself, you're out of your damn mind. Coach Miller's face darkened. Mr. Carter. This conversation is over, Ethan cut him off. He took Tiana's hand and led her toward the door. Ethan, the principal started. File whatever complaint you want, Ethan snapped. But if you think I'm going to let you treat my daughter this way, you don't know me very well. Tiana's head whipped toward him. Your daughter? Ethan stopped walking. His chest tightened. He hadn't meant to say it, but it had slipped out naturally, without hesitation. Tiana's lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. Come on, Ethan said, his voice soft. Let's go home. That night, Tiana sat at the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. Mean what? Ethan sat down next to her. When you called me your daughter. Ethan's throat tightened. He hesitated, then said, yes. Tiana's eyes shone with something that might have been tears. She looked down at her mug, her expression unreadable. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she said. Get used to it, Ethan said softly. Because I'm not going anywhere. Slowly, Tiana's hand slipped into his. Thanks. Dad. Ethan froze. Tiana's gaze stayed on the floor, but the word was clear and deliberate. His heart twisted painfully in his chest as he squeezed her hand. Anytime, sweetheart. Ethan sat there long after Tiana had gone to bed, his heart still racing. He'd walked into that school as a single man trying to do the right thing. He left knowing, for the first time, that he wasn't just a man taking care of 6 girls. He was their father. Ethan's house had always been quiet. Too quiet. But not anymore. Now, it was filled with the sounds of footsteps racing down the hall, the buzz of overlapping conversations, the occasional slam of a bedroom door, and the constant murmur of life. But lately, the noise had changed. It was sharper. Tense. Fractured. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes while listening to the sounds of another argument unfolding down the hall. Amaya's voice, sharp and cutting. Tiana's voice, loud and angry. You think you know everything. At least I'm not acting like a victim. I'm not a victim. Then stop acting like one. Ethan sighed and set down the dish. This was the third fight this week. Amaya and Tiana had always been the most independent, the most guarded. But since the school incident, things had been spiraling. Girls. Ethan called. No response. The shouting continued. Hey. Ethan's voice sharpened as he walked toward the hallway. He found them in the living room, standing inches apart. Amaya's fists were clenched at her sides, her eyes blazing. Tiana's jaw was set in angry defiance. Enough. Ethan's voice was sharp and commanding. What the hell is going on? Tiana's face was flushed with anger. She thinks I should have just let that kid say whatever he wanted to me. I didn't say that, Amaya shot back. But maybe punching someone isn't the solution to every problem. And what should I have done, huh? Tiana's eyes narrowed. Let him walk all over me. I'm saying you need to be smart about it. Oh, I get it, Tiana's lips curled bitterly. You want me to be quiet? You want me to just sit there and take it like you do? Amaya's eyes flashed dangerously. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Tiana yelled. I'm not weak. Amaya's face twisted. Neither am I. That's enough. Ethan's voice boomed through the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Both girls flinched and turned toward him. I don't care who started it, Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. I don't care who's right or wrong. What I care about is that you're sisters. And you will not stand here and tear each other apart in my house. Tiana's chest heaved. Amaya's fist slowly unclenched. Tiana, Ethan said, softening his tone, go cool off. Now. Tiana's gaze lingered on Amaya for a long, tense second. Then, with a sharp shake of her head, she stormed down the hall and slammed her bedroom door. Ethan ran a hand down his face. His heart was still pounding. What the hell is going on with you two? He asked Amaya. Amaya's gaze darkened. She's reckless. She acts without thinking. And you don't. Amaya's lips tightened. I don't make trouble. I survive. Surviving isn't the same as living, Ethan said. And sometimes, fighting back is the only way to survive. Amaya's gaze softened but only slightly. She's going to get herself hurt. And you think you can protect her by pushing her away? Amaya's jaw tightened. Someone has to be strong. Ethan's chest ached at the weight of her words. He knew where it came from. Amaya had taken on the role of protector since the day they lost their parents. She was the shield, the quiet strength behind her sisters. Amaya, it's not your job to carry everything. Amaya's gaze sharpened. If I don't, who will? Ethan reached out, resting his hand on her shoulder. I will, he said softly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Amaya's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she shook her head and pulled away. I'm fine, she said, her voice stiff. We don't need you to save us. Ethan's heart twisted. Maybe not. But you need someone to have your back. Amaya's expression flickered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amaya turned toward the stairs. I'll talk to her, Ethan said. Amaya hesitated. Good luck. Later that night, Ethan knocked gently on Tiana's bedroom door. No answer. He opened it slowly and found her curled up on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Can I come in? Tiana shrugged. Ethan sat down at the edge of the bed. Wanna tell me what that was about? Tiana didn't answer. Ethan sighed. Tiana, I'm not mad. I need to understand. Tiana's jaw tightened. She thinks I'm reckless. She's scared. Tiana's head snapped toward him. Of what? Of losing you. Tiana's mouth parted slightly. Amaya has been holding everything together since the day you lost your parents, Ethan said quietly. But now she's not alone anymore. And that scares her. Tiana swallowed hard. She thinks I'm weak. No, Ethan said firmly. She thinks you're strong. But you're not invincible. Tiana's expression softened. Her lips trembled. I hate how they look at me. I know. And it's not going to stop, is it? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. No. It's not. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. Then what am I supposed to do? Ethan's hand slid over hers. You face it? How? With your sisters. And with me. A tear slipped down Tiana's cheek. I don't know if I can. You can. How do you know? Ethan smiled faintly. Because you already have. Tiana's gaze searched his face. Slowly, she rested her head against his shoulder. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly. I've got you, he whispered. I've always got you. Tiana's breath hitched. Promise, she whispered. Promise. Ethan sat there for a long time, holding his daughter as she cried. He knew this wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would keep coming. But they would face them together. Ethan's hands were shaking. He stood outside the principal's office, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Through the glass window, he could see Tiana sitting across from the principal, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched forward. It was happening again. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing heart. Stay calm, he whispered to himself. Stay calm for her. The door swung open, and the principal, Mrs. Carter, stepped out. A thin woman with sharp eyes and a severe expression, she looked at Ethan with the kind of tired annoyance that made his blood boil. Mr. Carter, please come in. Ethan stepped into the office. Tiana didn't look up. Sit, Mrs. Carter said briskly, gesturing toward the chair next to Tiana. Ethan sat down, resting his hand lightly on Tiana's back. What happened? He asked, his tone low and controlled. Mrs. Carter sat down behind her desk, folding her hands in front of her. Tiana was involved in another altercation. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind of altercation? Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. She punched another student. Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She was looking at the floor, her lips pressed together. Why? Ethan asked carefully. Because he wouldn't stop calling me names, Tiana said, her voice quiet but sharp. Ethan's heart twisted painfully. What names? Tiana's hands curled into fists. The same ones as before. Mrs. Carter sighed. Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but we cannot tolerate physical violence in this school. And what about the kid who insulted her? We'll be handling that separately. Handling said coldly. I'm not, Mrs. Carter said flatly. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. And for racism? Ethan asked. Mrs. Carter's mouth pressed into a thin line. We're working on improving that. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not good enough. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Carter said stiffly. Ethan stood, his eyes flashing with anger. Come on, Tiana. Tiana hesitated. Am I really suspended? Yes, Mrs. Carter said. Ethan's hand settled protectively on Tiana's back. We're leaving. Mr. Carter, this will go on her record. And I'll make sure it comes off, Ethan said icily. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. Threatening the school board won't help you. It's not a threat, Ethan said darkly. It's a promise. Tiana followed Ethan out of the office without another word. In the car, they sat in silence for a long time. Tiana stared out the window, her jaw tight and her arms crossed over her chest. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'm proud of you, he said finally. Tiana's gaze slid toward him. Why? Because that's what this world wants you to believe, he said softly. That you're the problem. That you're too loud or too angry or too different. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. But they're wrong, Ethan said. You hear me? They are wrong. Tiana swallowed hard. It's not fair, she whispered. I know, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. But you're not alone anymore. Slowly, Tiana reached for his hand. Ethan squeezed her fingers tightly. I'm tired of fighting, she said softly. Then let me fight for you. Tiana's lower lip trembled. Okay, she whispered. That night, Amaya was waiting for them when they got home. What happened? She asked immediately. Tiana rolled her eyes. Suspended. Amaya's eyes narrowed. Why? Because some kid called me a name and I punched him. Amaya sighed. Tiana. Don't start, Tiana snapped. I'm not apologizing for defending myself. You shouldn't have had to. Tiana's head whipped toward her. What? Amaya's gaze hardened. That's the problem. You shouldn't have had to defend yourself in the first place. Tiana's eyes widened. What they did was wrong, Amaya said. And so is punishing you for it? Tiana blinked rapidly. You think I was right? Amaya hesitated. I think you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. Tiana's face twisted. Well, I did. And I'm sorry for that, Amaya said quietly. Tiana's eyes softened. Slowly, Amaya extended her hand. After a long pause, Tiana took it. Ethan watched them from across the room, his heart lifting slightly. Small steps. All right, he said, standing. Family meeting. Living room. Now. The girls groaned but gathered on the couch anyway. Ethan stood before them, his arms crossed. We're going to figure this out together, he said. Because what happened today isn't just about Tiana. It's not. Sierra asked. No. Ethan's gaze darkened. This is about all of you. About how this town sees you. About how people treat you. Amaya's jaw tightened. And how are you going to fix that? We're not going to fix it, Ethan said simply. But we're not going to let it break us either. Tiana's gaze sharpened. What are you saying? I'm saying that if this town wants to see us as outsiders, let them. Amaya's eyes narrowed. And we'll show them why they're wrong. Tiana smiled faintly. How? Ethan's expression darkened with quiet determination. We fight back. By hitting people? Lena asked. No, Ethan said. By being better than them. By succeeding in spite of them. And when they push you down, we stand back up, Amaya said quietly. Ethan nodded. Together. A quiet strength filled the room. Amaya leaned back into the couch, a small smile pulling at her lips. So, what's the plan? Ethan's smile was dark and sharp. First, he said. We're getting that suspension overturned. Tiana's lips curled into a smile. And after that? Ethan's smile sharpened. We show this town exactly who they're dealing with. The morning sunlight filtered through the living room window, casting a warm glow across the floorboards. Ethan stood by the window, his hands resting on his hips as he stared at the street outside. The town was waking up. Neighbors walking their dogs. Kids biking down the sidewalk. Parents loading their kids into cars for school. But beneath the quiet surface, Ethan could feel the tension simmering. Tiana's suspension hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd heard the whispers. Seen the judgmental glances. Of course she lashed out. What do you expect? That family was always going to be trouble. He shouldn't have adopted them. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had lived in this town for years. Served it. Protected it. But the moment his girls were seen as a problem, the town's loyalty had evaporated like smoke. They don't get to decide who belongs in this family, Ethan muttered under his breath. Behind him, footsteps padded into the room. He turned to see Amaya standing near the staircase, her arms crossed over her chest. You sure about this? She asked. Yeah, Ethan said. We can't let them win. And how are we going to fight this? Amaya's gaze sharpened. The school board isn't going to listen to you. They've already made up their minds. Then we make them listen. Ethan's eyes flashed with determination. We force them to see the truth. Amaya's lips curled slightly. And how do we do that? We get the community involved. Amaya's eyebrows shot up. And how exactly are you going to convince a town full of judgmental bigots to take our side? Not everyone's against us, Ethan said. There are good people here, people who know what's right. We just have to give them a reason to stand with us. And if they don't? Ethan smiled grimly. Then we fight harder. Later that day, Ethan and Amaya stood in front of the school board office, their backs straight and their expressions hard. A small crowd had gathered, parents, teachers, and even a few students who had heard about Tiana's suspension. Tiana stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was tense, guarded. Sierra stood beside her, quiet but focused. What if they don't listen? Sierra asked. They will, Ethan said. Because we're not backing down. Yet. Tiana said. And what if they laugh us out of the room? Then we come back tomorrow, Ethan said simply. And the next day. And the next. Tiana's gaze softened. You're serious about this, she said. Damn right I am. Just then, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Mother Henrietta. Dressed in her usual crisp church attire, her gray hair swept into a tight bun, she moved through the crowd with calm authority. Her sharp eyes met Ethan's. Well, she said. What's the plan? Ethan smiled faintly. Glad you could make it, Mother Henrietta. I've been waiting for you to fight back, Ethan, she said. Took you long enough. Better late than never. Mother Henrietta's eyes softened as she glanced at Tiana. You've got a strong girl there. I know. The crowd began to grow larger. More people arriving. Some familiar faces. Some strangers. Even a few of Ethan's fellow officers showed up, standing toward the back, arms crossed. Amaya stepped closer to Ethan. Okay. They're here. Now what? Now, Ethan said, we make them listen. Inside the school board office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces a mixture of boredom and thinly veiled disdain. Mrs. Carter sat at the center, her mouth drawn into a tight line. Ethan stood in front of them, flanked by Amaya and Mother Henrietta. Tiana sat in the audience, her arms crossed. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter began stiffly, you requested this meeting to challenge your daughter's suspension. We've already reviewed the case. The decision stands. Then you didn't review it hard enough, Ethan said, his voice calm but sharp. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. You're punishing my daughter for defending herself, Ethan said. But the boy who insulted her? He gets a warning. Mrs. Carter's lips thinned. Mr. Carter. No, Ethan cut in. You listen to me. My daughter was called names. Racial slurs. And when she stood up for herself, you punished her. That's not justice. That's cowardice. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. Then enforce a zero-tolerance policy for racism, Ethan shot back. That's not how this works. Then change the system. Mrs. Carter's face darkened. Look around, Ethan said, gesturing to the crowd behind him. Do you see how many people showed up today? These are the people you represent. And they are watching you right now. They're watching to see if you have the courage to do what's right or if you're going to keep pretending this town doesn't have a problem. Mrs. Carter's jaw tightened. Tiana stood up for herself, Ethan said, his voice rising. She fought back because no one else did. And now you're punishing her for it? The board members exchanged nervous glances. This isn't just about my daughter, Ethan continued. This is about how this town treats people who don't look like everyone else. And you know what? We're done being quiet about it. Silence. Mrs. Carter's expression flickered the first crack in her carefully composed mask. Ethan's gaze darkened. So what's it going to be? Mrs. Carter inhaled sharply. We'll review the case. No, Ethan said coldly. You'll overturn the suspension. Today. Mrs. Carter's hands curled into fists. You're putting us in a difficult position, Mr. Carter. Good, Ethan said. A long silence stretched across the room. Finally, Mrs. Carter's gaze dropped. The suspension is overturned, she said reluctantly. A wave of relief swept through the room. Tiana's eyes widened. Thank you, Ethan said. Mrs. Carter stood. Don't thank me. I'm not, Ethan said. As they walked out of the office, Mother Henrietta smiled knowingly. That was impressive, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. We're not done yet. No, Mother Henrietta agreed. But it's a start. Ethan glanced at Tiana, who was walking ahead of them, her head held higher than it had been in weeks. Yeah, Ethan said softly. It's a start. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, streaking the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. His house was unusually quiet, the calm after the storm. It had been 2 days since the school board overturned Tiana's suspension. 2 days since Ethan had stood before that room of judgmental faces and forced them to face their own hypocrisy. 2 days since Tiana had smiled at him, really smiled for the first time in weeks. But Ethan knew that winning one battle wasn't the same as winning the war. One suspension overturned doesn't mean this town has changed. He rubbed the back of his neck, tension coiling in his shoulders. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Amaya appeared table toward him. I've been thinking about what you said about how we have to make this town listen. About how we need to change the way things work. Ethan opened the folder. Inside were printed reports, newspaper articles, statistics, a carefully compiled record of racial discrimination cases from their town over the last decade. Suspensions, unfair punishments, racial bias in hiring, even reports of police profiling. You did all this? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Amaya nodded. It wasn't that hard to find once I started digging. This isn't just about Tiana. It's about how this town treats anyone who doesn't fit the mold. Ethan's eyes darkened as he flipped through the pages. This is bad. I know. What are you suggesting? Amaya leaned forward, her gaze sharp. We can't just fight each battle individually. That's what they expect us to do, react, get angry, let it fade. We need to go bigger. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Bigger. We start a foundation, Amaya said. A real one. A place where kids like Tiana and adults can go for support. Somewhere they can feel safe, where they can learn how to defend themselves, know their rights, and get legal protection when they need it. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. That's ambitious. It's necessary, Amaya said. If we want to change the way this town works, we have to give people the tools to fight back. Ethan sat back in his chair, considering. He glanced at the folder again, at the statistics, the cold hard evidence of what had been happening under the surface of their nice little town for years. He thought about Tiana. About how close she had come to giving up. It's going to take a lot of work, he said finally. I know, Amaya replied. But we have the connections. You know the police force, I know the schools, and Mother Henrietta has more influence in this town than anyone gives her credit for. Ethan's mouth quirked into a faint smile. That's true. I've already spoken to her, Amaya said. She's in. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Really, Amaya said. She said, and I quote, about damn time. Ethan chuckled. That sounds like her. Amaya's gaze sharpened. But we need you too, Dad. People listen to you. They respect you even if some of them don't deserve you. Ethan's smile faded slightly. This could put a target on us, he said quietly. You understand that, right? Let them come, Amaya said, her eyes flashing with determination. We've already survived worse. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought about Tiana's tearful eyes in the car that day. The way the school board had looked at her like she was a problem instead of a person. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. A week later. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the main hall. On the walls were posters of black leaders and activists: Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Angela Davis. Ethan stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone as the crowd settled. Amaya stood beside him, calm and focused. Tiana, Sierra, and the other girls sat in the front row, their eyes shining with curiosity and quiet excitement. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice carrying through the hall. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. He saw familiar faces: Mother Henrietta, Officer Brown from the department, even Mrs. Thompson sitting stiffly toward the back. "You all know why we're here," Ethan said. "Our town has a problem. A problem that's been ignored for too long. A problem of racism, discrimination, and injustice." The room was dead silent. "We've seen it in our schools," Ethan continued. "We've seen